The Italian governorate of Montenegro existed from October 1941 to September 1943 as an occupied territory under military government of Fascist Italy during World War II. Although the Italians had intended to establish a quasi-independent Montenegrin kingdom, these plans were permanently shelved after a popular uprising in July 1941. Following the Italian surrender in September 1943, the territory of Montenegro was occupied by German forces which withdrew in December 1944. Background: prior to the creation of the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, Montenegro had been recognized as an independent state for 40 years. Immediately prior to the creation of the KSCS in December 1918, the Kingdom of Montenegro was unified with the Kingdom of Serbia and ceased to exist as an independent state. From 1922 onward, as part of the KSCS and then Yugoslavia, Montenegro was not a subdivision of the state. In the period immediately after the First World War, agrarian reform resulted in some transfer of population from mountainous areas of Montenegro to other areas of Yugoslavia, including the Macedonian and Kosovo regions. This population movement also achieved a political goal of increasing the Serb population in those areas. After 1929, the Zeta Banovina of Yugoslavia included all of modern-day Montenegro, as well as adjacent parts of modern-day Serbia, Kosovo, Croatia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. As in former Montenegrin states, the capital of the Zeta Banovina was Cetinje. In August 1939, ethnic Croat areas of the Zeta Banovina from the Bay of Kota to Pelješac including Dubrovnik were merged with the new Banovina of Croatia. The last Ban of Zeta Banovina was Blazo Fukanović, a former brigadier general in the Royal Yugoslav Army. In May 1940, as a means of opposing the government, the Montenegrin branch of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia advocated that Royal Yugoslav Army reservists demobilize, refuse military discipline, and even desert. In October of that year, the KPJ National Conference heavily criticized this action by the Montenegrin branch of the party, and reoriented the KPJ toward defending the country against imperialist attackers. History: invasion in April 1941. As part of the German-led Axis invasion of Yugoslavia, the Zeta Banovina was attacked by the Germans from Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Italians from Albania. The Italians moved through on the 16th of April on the way towards Dalmatia. The Germans later withdrew, leaving the Italians to occupy the area. The occupation forces initially consisted of the 18th Infantry Division Messina, which was part of the Italian 17th Corps of the 9th Army, which had its headquarters in Albania. The 9th Army was also responsible for those parts of Kosovo and Western Macedonia that had been annexed to Albania. Initial occupation. On the 17th of April, the commander of the 17th Corps, General di Corpo d'Armata Giuseppe Pafundi, received a message from the Italian viceroy in Albania, Francesco Giacomini, authorizing him to set up a new government in Cetinje. The following day he received a further message advising him that a Committee for the Liberation of Montenegro had been formed in the Albanian capital, Tirana, and would be basis of a provisional government of Montenegro. On the 28th of April, Count Serafino Mazzolini was appointed the civil commissioner for Montenegro, but subordinated to the high command of the Italian armed forces in Albania. Elsewhere in Italian-occupied territories, the installation of a civilian commissioner would usually have been a prelude to annexation, and some laws enacted by the Italians indicate that Montenegro was close to becoming an Italian province. Italian flags were distributed and flown. Photographs of Benito Mussolini and King of Italy were displayed in public offices, and the fascist Roman salute was made compulsory. Arrangements were made to form fascist party organizations, and strict censorship was imposed. Italian bureaucrats were tasked to supervise the finances of public bodies, insurance companies and banks, and all schools were ordered closed until the end of 1941. On their arrival in Cetinje, the Italian forces had been met by the group of separatists known as Greens, who called themselves the Committee for the Liberation of Montenegro. This group was encouraged by the Italians to form a council to advise the occupation authorities, which was established by Mussolini on the 18th of May. The Interim Advisory Committee was symbolically vested with civil powers, but the Italian military remained the real decision-makers. The committee was to work alongside the Italian military authorities, who replaced the Zita Banovina government, but appointed committees for various towns and reactivated the pre-existing bureaucracy. The committee really only drew support from the Greens, who overestimated what the Italians were offering for the collaboration. On the 22nd of May, the Interim Advisory Committee was dissolved, but the former Yugoslav civil service authorities remained at the posts after they swore an oath of allegiance to Italy. On the 19th of June, Mussolini was appointed as High Commissioner, responsible to the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs for matters of civil administration in the occupied territory. The Italians were friendly and lenient towards the Montenegrins. Initially, the Italians intended that Montenegro would become an independent state closely allied with Italy, reinforced through the strong dynastic links between Italy and Montenegro. As Queen Elena of Italy was a daughter of the last Montenegrin monarch Nicholas I, they were relying heavily on information provided by a group of émigré loyalists of the deposed House of Petrović-Njegoš, that had ruled Montenegro for centuries prior to the union with the Kingdom of Serbia in 1918. They also believed that all members of the Greens, who had opposed union with Serbia in 1918, wanted full independence for Montenegro, rather than a Montenegrin unit within a federal Yugoslavia. In reality, the Greens consisted of two factions, one led by Krsto Popović and one by Sekula Drjević. Popović sought a fully independent Montenegro, but was willing to consider a separate entity within a federal Yugoslavia depending on the outcome of the war, and his group included some members of the Montenegrin Federalist Party. Drjević rejected the idea of the reformation of Yugoslavia after the war, and was willing to work with the Italians to achieve independence. Dissatisfaction, the Montenegrins quickly developed grievances against the Italians. These grievances mainly related to the expulsion of Montenegrin people from the Kosovo region and Bačka and Baranja, as well as the influx of refugees from other parts of Yugoslavia and those fleeing the Ustaše terror in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Montenegrin people also had grievances against the Italians regarding their annexation of important food-producing territory in Kosovo and a salt-producing facility at Ulcinj to Albania, and the economic damage inflicted on many Montenegrins by the temporary removal from circulation of Yugoslav banknotes of 500 dinars and more. There were three reasons the Italians had to be very wary of dissatisfaction among the Montenegrin people: the large numbers of unsecured military weapons following the collapse of the Yugoslav army, significant numbers of former Yugoslav army officers and men that had been repatriated following the capture during the invasion, and the strength of the KPJ in the occupied territory. Around 400 former Yugoslav army officers returned to Montenegro, along with many non-commissioned officers, civil administrators and communists. During the invasion, the Yugoslav Zeta division, composed mostly of Montenegrins, had briefly counter-attacked into Albania, but had largely returned home with the weapons and equipment following the Yugoslav surrender. In early July 1941, a senior Montenegrin member of the Politburo of the Central Committee of the KPJ, Milovan Filas, arrived in Montenegro from Belgrade to start the communist struggle against the occupying forces. Declaration of Independence. Derived and his colleagues were able to convince the Italians that if they created an independent Montenegro with Italian support, there would be little opposition. In early June 1941, Mussolini formed a consultative council consisting of 65 Italian paid deputies who were willing to work with the Italian authorities. In early July, the town and village committees sent their delegates to the National Assembly in Cetinje in order to declare the restoration of Montenegro. The declaration would abolish the November 1918 union with Serbia, Montenegro's relationship to the Serbian Karađorđević dynasty, and the Yugoslav Constitution of 1931. It would also proclaim that Montenegro was a sovereign and independent state ruled by a constitutional monarchy. When the members of the National Assembly realized that the declaration would result in a union of the Italian monarchy with Montenegro, and offered no real independence to the new state, nearly all of the delegates returned to the towns and villages. No member of the Petrović-Njegoš dynasty was willing to accept the throne, so the National Assembly decided to establish a regency. The declaration was passed by acclamation on the 12th of July. Uprising on the 13th of July 1941. There was a general uprising against the Italians, initiated by the Montenegrin branch of the KPJ. The event that triggered the uprising was the proclamation on the previous day of a restored Kingdom of Montenegro headed by an Italian regent and led by Montenegrin separatist Derived and the Greens. The insurgents also included large numbers of Serb nationalists known as Whites, who stood for close ties to Serbia, and former Yugoslav army officers, some of whom had recently been released from prisoner of war camps. Officers were in command, with the communists doing the organization and providing political commissars. Serbs fleeing the Ustaš's terror in Herzegovina played a significant part in the uprising. The rebels seized control of small towns and villages in the early phase of the uprising. Amidst the worst of the fighting during the successful attack he led on Bahrain, then Captain Pavle Therazic distinguished himself, and emerged as one of the main commanders of the uprising. During the attack on Bahrain, Therazic fought alongside communist insurgent forces. The other main commanders included the former Yugoslav army officers Colonel Bajo Stanišić and Major Thodija Lasić. The Italians were caught completely unprepared, and within a few days, Cetinje had been completely isolated from the rest of the occupied territory, and the occupation force had to call for support from its higher headquarters in Albania. The Italian Foreign Minister, Count Galeazzo Ciano, was shocked by the uprising, and was concerned about the ability of the Italian army to suppress it. The uprising was premature, and a force of 67,000 Italian troops regained control over all towns and communication routes within 6 weeks, assisted by Muslim and Albanian irregular forces from border areas who provided flank security. The commander of the Italian Ninth Army based in Albania, General Domitor Alessandro Alessandro Pirciobiroli, placed the commander of the 14th Corps, General di Corpo Armata Luigi Mentesti, in command of all Italian forces in Montenegro, and gave him orders to crush the revolt. Pirciobiroli directed his forces to avoid acts of revenge and useless cruelty. Nevertheless, in crushing the revolt, dozens of villages were burned, hundreds were killed, and between 10,000 and 20,000 inhabitants were interned. For a while, the Muslim and Albanian irregulars were permitted to pillage and torch villages. For the first few months after the uprising began, the insurgent groups included KPJ members and the followers, as well as Serb nationalists, and the leadership of the groups was also mixed. Unlike the partisans, who had strong central direction from the outset, during these early stages the nationalists in Montenegro had little or no contact with the headquarters of Draza Mihailovic, who would eventually become the titular leader of the Chetnik movement in Yugoslavia. Outside of coordination provided by APJ members, the nationalists did not necessarily work together, even with those in the neighboring district. Their motivation for fighting was mainly to protect the families. A split then developed between the communist leaders of the uprising and the nationalists that had participated. The nationalists recognized that the uprising had been defeated and wanted to stop fighting, unlike the partisans, who were determined to continue the struggle. During the autumn, the nationalists contacted the Italians and offered to assist them to fight the partisans. Subsequently, the nationalists, including Thurasic, who was popular in his own Vasovic clan of northern Montenegro, withdrew into the hinterland. The focus of the nationalists, such as Thurasic, was to avoid provoking the Italians but to protect the mountain villages if they were attacked. In northern Montenegro, there was a marked distinction between the communists and nationalists, with the nationalists having closer ties with Serbia and a frontier mentality towards Muslims. The communists wanted to continue with the revolution by turning against the class enemies, whilst Usta's manipulation of the Muslims in the Sandak and the expulsion of Serbs from the areas annexed by Albania combined to make Thurasic and his Chetniks impatient to continue with the uprising by turning on the Muslims and Albanians in the region. The uprising continued to a reduced extent until December 1941. As a result of the uprising, the Italians decided to abolish Mazzolini's position as High Commissioner. On 3 October 1941, the territory was retitled the Governorate del Montenegro, and Biroli was appointed governor with responsibility for both military and civil affairs. On 1 December, the 14th Corps was redesignated the command of the troops of Montenegro. Chetnik commanders from Montenegro. In early November 1941, a split developed between the Chetniks and partisans in the territory of the military commander in Serbia. The leader of the Chetniks in the territory was Mihailovic, who was soon to enjoy the support of the Yugoslav government in exile. Once the Montenegrin nationalists heard about the split between Mihailovic's Chetniks and the partisans, there was an increased impetus for them to collaborate with the Italian occupation forces. On 20 December 1941, Mihailovic appointed Thurasic as his commander of all regular and reserve troops in central and eastern Montenegro and parts of the Sandak. Thurasic's appointment occurred when he traveled to Serbia in late December 1941 and early January 1942 to meet with Mihailovic, and returned with detailed instructions which bore Mihailovic's signature. These instructions included directives for cleansing the Muslim population from Sandak and the Muslim and Croat populations from Bosnia and Herzegovina, amongst other orders. Historians Lucian Karchma, Stephen K. Pavlovich and Nil Malcolm believe that the document was a forgery made by Thurzik after he failed to reach Mihailovich, who, because German forces in Serbia had mounted an operation targeting Mihailovich's forces, had been driven out of Ravna Gora. In contrast, historians Mateo J. Milazzo, Jozo Tomasovic and Sabrina P. Ramit consider the document to be authentic and attribute the instructions to Mihailovich. Despite his possession of these instructions, Thurzik initially had very little influence on the non-communist elements of the Montenegrin resistance and was unable to develop an effective strategy against the Italians or partisans in the first few months after his return to Montenegro. In early 1942, his Chetnik detachment became more active, especially in eastern Montenegro and the Sandak against local Muslims. Left terrors. The partisans occupied Kolasin in January and February 1942, and turned against all real and potential opposition, killing about 300 of the population and throwing the mangled corpses into pits they called the Dogs' Cemetery. Due to this and other examples of communist terror, the Montenegrin population turned against the partisans. Thurzik soon recaptured Kolasin and held it as a Chetnik bastion until May 1943. According to more reliable sources, the number of persons killed in Kolasin at the time was between 16 and 38. Collaboration with Italians. In the autumn of 1941, the Nationalists contacted the Italian occupation forces offering to assist the Italians to fight the partisans. In early February, Stanisic withdrew 2 units under his command from the insurgent front line around Danilovgrad in central Montenegro, allowing the besieged Italians to break out and defeat the partisans. Soon after, Stanisic helped the Italians to retake Nikšić. By mid-February 1942, individual Chetnik units were concluding formal agreements to cooperate with the Italians. The first agreement was between Stanisic and the commander of the 48th Infantry Division Taro, and was effective from the 17th of February. Soon after, Thurzik entered into an agreement with Biroli regarding collaboration between Thurzik's Chetniks and the Italians in the area of operations of the 19th Infantry Division Venezia. On the 6th of March, an agreement was signed between Stanisic and Biroli. These agreements related to Chetnik action against the partisans, for which they would receive arms and supplies from the Italians. The Italians' primary aim in entering into these agreements was to minimize their own losses. Initially, Stanisic referred to his forces as the Montenegrin National Army, and claimed to be the Chetnik commander for both Montenegro and Herzegovina. In late February or early March, Mihailovich sent one of his agents to join Stanisic, who began to coordinate his activities with the other significant Chetnik leaders in Montenegro. On the 9th of March, a large group of former Royal Yugoslav Army officers met at Cetinje and elected Thukanović to command all nationalist forces in Montenegro. The election of Thukanović was accepted by Mihailovich, and may have even been suggested by him. Between March and June 1942, the power of the Chetniks increased in Montenegro due to a combination of factors. Their agreements with the Italians was the first of these, along with the arms and supplies that accompanied the agreements. The other factor was the weakening of the partisans, which was mainly caused by the impact of the left terrors. During this period, Stanisic's Chetniks fought the partisans in the Nikšić area alongside the Italians, and Thurzik's Chetniks did likewise in the Kolasin district of northern Montenegro. In May, Therazic's Chetniks defeated the Derived partisan detachment, which was the last large partisan unit remaining in Montenegro. On the 24th of July 1942, a comprehensive agreement was reached between Thukhanovic and Biroli, which expanded the areas covered and ensured that the Chetniks in Montenegro could bear the brunt of the fighting against the partisans. Specifically, the Thukhanovic-Biroli agreement stated that the Chetniks were to continue uncompromising struggle against the Communists and were to cooperate with the Italian authorities in the restoration and maintenance of law and order. It mandated the creation of 3 flying detachments of 1,500 men each, commanded by Therazic, Stanizic and the separatist leader Popovic, and covered pet rations, arms and support for the families. These detachments were already in existence and had been integrated with Italian forces during operations against the partisans in June. The agreement also endorsed the pre-existing Committee of Montenegrin Nationalists led by Thukhanovic. The agreement stated that the nationalists had no political agenda except fighting communism and maintaining law and order and the well-being of the Montenegrin population. The conclusion of the agreement obligated Thukhanovic's committee to do everything in its power to preserve order and to fight anyone opposing the Italian occupiers. Tomasevic states that given Mihailovic had been in Montenegro for 2 months prior to this agreement being concluded, it is fair to assume that he knew about and was satisfied with it, and Milazzo states that these accommodations with the Italians were sought with Mihailovic's personal approval. This agreement was consistent with Mihailovic's aim of having an army in waiting that could turn against the occupiers, and with the support of the Western Allies, bring him to power. He had taken a similar approach with the legalized Chetniks in German-occupied Serbia. The Chetniks were important to the Italian occupiers as they controlled the hinterland and allowed the Italians to concentrate on maintaining law and order in the larger towns and on the major routes in the occupied territory. From June 1942 until around April 1943, the Chetniks controlled a very large part of the occupied territory. In addition to the 3,000 Chetniks in the 2 flying detachments, the Montenegrin Chetniks had several times that number who were not legalized by the Italians but were engaged in fighting the partisans. Popovic, the Montenegrin separatist leader and commander of the 3rd Flying Detachment, had been collaborating with the Italians from the time of the invasion, and continued to do so, having reached a fragile understanding with the Chetniks during the first half of 1942. Both the Chetniks and separatists tried to get as much support as possible from the Italians, which included the importation of food for the population who supported them. Sahovaci Conference. Between the 30th of November and the 2nd of December 1942, Chetniks from Montenegro and Sandak met at a conference in the village of Sahovaci nearby Jelopolia. 3 Chetnik commanders, Zahari Yarostovic, Lasic and Therazic, represented Mihailovic, and the proceedings bore an official stamp. The conference was dominated by Therazic and its resolutions expressed extremism and intolerance, as well as an agenda which focused on restoring the pre-war status quo in Yugoslavia implemented in its initial stages by Chetnik dictatorship. It also laid claim to parts of the territory of Yugoslavia's neighbors. Case Black Italian capitulation demographics. By the 31st of July 1941, the population of the occupied territory was estimated at 411,000. Geography. The occupied territory of Montenegro was far smaller in area than pre-Yugoslav Montenegro. At its core was a small area running south into the Sandak from Bahrain, including the towns of Prijepolje, Bijelopolje, Sjenica, and some villages around Tutin and Rosaje, incorporating a Muslim minority numbering 80,000. The Bay of Kota was annexed as part of the Italian governorate of Dalmatia, and the border between the independent state of Croatia and Montenegro followed the limb in the Drina region as far as Hum, then via Dobri Sevo to the Adriatic. Along its coastline and southeastern borders, Montenegro lost Metohija to Albania, including Bar, a strip of land north of Lake Scutari, the town of Ulcinj, an area northeast of Podgorica along the Yugoslav-Albanian border, and a significant amount of the Andrićevica district including Plav and Guzanja. Western and central Kosovo were also annexed to Albania, including the towns of Prizren, Dragos and Pristina. Mitrovica and the Abar River Valley were incorporated into the German-occupied territory of Serbia, including the towns of Kukavica, Podujevo and Medveda, and the Trepča zinc mines. Also included in the German-occupied territory of Serbia was the eastern Sandak incorporating Novi Pazar. In addition to the modifications to the western border mentioned above, some of the western Sandak, Foča and Kajnis were included in the NDH.